All right. So, I told you guys the first day, the ones of you that were here, that I wouldn't apologize for treating you like adults and treating this like a university. And I've asked you to read a very challenging, provocative reading right out of the gate. Okay? So if, you couldn't understand it all, or you struggled with it, or blew your mind, that's fine. The point of what we're doing now is to make sure that what you understood you can share. What you didn't understand, someone else can help you see, right? And so, this is where I teach. It's where you teach, okay? So let me just give you just a couple of pieces of background. This piece comes from Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's, arguably the most prominent black intellectual in America right now. There are others, but his star is shining very bright. This is a book called We Were 8 Years in Power. It's 8 essays that he has written in the last decade or so. Most of them appeared in the Atlantic magazine. And anyway, he collected these essays, he and his editor, and he decided, I heard him do a talk about this, he decided that, the essays stood on their own, but he wanted to actually contextualize them. So the first section you guys read was his contextualization of the essay, We Were 8 Years in Power, or no, Why Blacks Don't Study the Civil War. Okay. So the title of the book is We Were 8 Years in Power, which I'm pretty sure, if you're like me, you thought he was referring to the Obama years. We, black people, were 8 years in power. But in fact, that's not what he's referring to in his title. He's actually referring to the years 1867 through 1875, when, during Reconstruction, blacks were enfranchised in the South. Many, many whites were disenfranchised in the South. And basically, black folk and Northerners possessed the political power in the South. We were 8 years in power, right? But what happened after that, basically? What happened after the 8 years in power? Okay.
All the slaves that had returned their belongings, their property?
No. They lost power. Think back to high school. What happens after Reconstruction? Jim Crow. Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. Blacks and whites can't ride on trains together, can't drink out of the same public facilities, can't occupy the same public space. Segregation. That is to say, whites and blacks living apart. Remember, during slavery, whites and blacks lived face to face. And oh, by the way, for those that were enslaved, for those black people that were enslaved, their white masters controlled them. Only after freedom does the South need a way of controlling the population, because now they're free. They're not slaves. And by the way, they're never re-enslaved, although sometimes we refer to this period after Reconstruction, this period here between Jim Crow in the 1880s and 1890s and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of the mid-1960s, we sometimes refer to this as a kind of second slavery, right? Because remember, from here to here, actually from here to about 1940 or 50, about 5,000 blacks were lynched in the South. Whites basically reimposed their white supremacist political system in the South. And blacks were, well, for lack of a better term, re-enslaved, although they weren't re-enslaved, right? Okay. So the 8 years in power here is Reconstruction. But he is making an argument that extends throughout the length of American history from 1619, the date when the first blacks were taken from Africa and got off the boat and were enslaved, from 1619 all the way down here to 2018. We're talking about a 400-year period. And Coates has an argument about that. Okay? So, with that in mind, let me do one more thing here, and then we'll get to talking. I'm going to do something that I don't normally do, which is to say I'm going to use a little PowerPoint presentation. Okay? I don't normally do PowerPoints for this, but for some reason I did for this. So anyway, the first question is, in Coates's telling, let me stop for a second. All right. I'm not interested in your opinion about things right now. I'm interested in what Coates has to say. There's only one thinker that I'm interested in right now, and it's Coates. Okay? So keep that in mind. All of the readings that we will do, I'm not interested in your opinion. I'm interested in what the author says. And the value of this exercise, even if you don't like history, the value of this exercise day after day in this class, the value will be to help you practice help you practice processing other people's arguments. I don't care if you agree. That's not the point. The value for you is not in whether you embrace it or not, although if you embrace it, I think that's fine. The value for you is to actually have to use your critical thinking skills and process the information, right? You can make your decisions later about, whether or not that represents the truth for you, okay? So, in Coates' telling, how central was the brand of white supremacy to the country even in 2008? Come back here. How central?
It's very central.
Explain.
Because since they got off the boat in 1619, we've always had a problem with white supremacy, even up until 2008, with everything that's happened between Reconstruction and then civil rights. Even with Obama, we were still given the country was such in bad shape that we had to give it to a black man.
Okay. Yeah, Coates' argument is that things were so bad in this country in 2008, and with all due respect, that we decided as a country, let's let the black guy do it, right? We were so upset with regular leadership, with the politicians, we were inundated with the financial crisis wherein 11 million people's homes were going to be upside down. People lost 40, 50, 60% of their investments. It was horrible, right? Entire multinational companies worth trillions of dollars. Some of them collapsed. They just went belly up, right? We rescued others, I get it. But the point is, it was so bad that we even entrusted a black guy, right? Who, by the way, wasn't just a black guy, he was also a white guy. Which is to say, his mother was white, his father was black, so there was this thing, right? We can get onto that later, we probably will. But the point is that you would say, Coates is arguing that white supremacy is fundamental to all of American history. Is that what you're saying? Okay, I agree with that. And let's just pull out a couple of quotes if we can, if I can get my little handy-dandy pointer to work. There we go. All right, so I pulled some quotes out like you guys. And one says, I said, absolutely central and always has been to the tribe of white supremacy. Maybe we'll come back to that. That's his phrase. The tribe of white supremacy. I think you're right. He argues that it's absolutely central. That white supremacy is absolutely central in American history. On page 62, Coates said, with reference to the election of Donald Trump, he said, we forgot during the Obama years, we forgot that there were those who loved that old country being the country of white supremacy, the country of slavery, the country where white people subjugated other people. He says, we forgot there were those who loved that old country as it was, who did not lament the divisions, but drew power from them. Now, we can interpret the rise of Trump in a lot of different ways, but, it's certainly arguable. That his movement drew power from the divisions in American society. I think that's kind of simple, right? It's almost incontrovertible, right? Now, I say, I've kind of melded together some of his writings with, my thoughts, but they're his. But anyway, let's think about the outbreak of the Civil War. When the Civil War broke out, did the North allow blacks to fight? Did the North allow blacks to fight at the beginning of the Civil War?
Not initially.
Not initially. So at the beginning they couldn't, right?
Right.
But at the end they could, right? Okay. And so his point is that the forces of Union thought white supremacy was still affordable. And what's that mean?
Well, it means that they thought that they could still resolve the fight through white people instead of having to just resort to black people to fight their fights for them.
Okay. But he says the forces of Union thought white supremacy was still affordable. So, in the North even, he says, abolition was denounced and blacks couldn't fight. But as deaths and years mounted, wallowing in white supremacy amidst the increase of dead was like wallowing in pearls amidst a famine. Emancipation was embraced. Blacks were recruited and sent into battle, where he says they killed white people to gain their freedom. Right? What's the point here? The point he's trying to make is that when the Civil War broke out, the North did not engage in the Civil War. They didn't start the Civil War. They didn't start fighting in the Civil War to do away with slavery. It only became a war about emancipation in 1863 when President Lincoln articulated his Emancipation Proclamation, right? It didn't start as a war about slavery then in the North. It did, however, start as a war about slavery in the South. So Alexander Stephens, the Vice President, Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, as Coates cites in his piece, said unequivocally that we are fighting to maintain slavery, right? Okay. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that from the perspective of the South, the Civil War was absolutely about slavery and white supremacy. On the part of the North, it wasn't immediately, but eventually it became about, shall we say, emancipation. And so, when the war was over, blacks had gained their freedom, and they had killed white people in the process to gain it, right? Then, after 1876, after Reconstruction, he says the country returned to its white supremacist roots and would, to one degree or another, remain that way. Think about that for a second. He's saying, when Reconstruction was over, notice, he doesn't say the South. He says the country. Now, wait a minute. In the North, blacks weren't re-enslaved. They were in the South. How can he say the country? How can he say the country? He says the country returned to its white supremacist roots and would, to one degree or another, remain that way. Don't know? Just say, yeah, by the way, you guys have permission to say, I don't know. I'm not sure. How about you? All right, how about you?
So that way he won't be referring to just one part of the country?
He's not referring just to the South. It would be easy to say the South returned to their racist ways. But that's what he says. He says the country returned to its racist ways.
And remain that way?
Well, that's true. He is saying and remain that way. So reading between the lines, he's saying it's been white supremacist for a long time. Okay, that's not an exact answer to my question, but let's come over here.
Well, the North did have laws that if there were slaves running away from the South, that they would return them back to the South to their owners.
But that was before the Civil War. You're talking about the Fugitive Slave Acts, but you're right. Yeah, I mean, that's true. I'm talking about after Reconstruction. He says the country returned to its white supremacist ways.
Would it be because they passed the Jim Crow laws and that's segregation for the whole country that they did?
Well, that's interesting that you say that. Actually, Jim Crow segregation did not exist in the states in the North, only in the states in the South. But here's the question. Did the North do anything to keep the South from instituting Jim Crow segregation? No. Didn't try to stop them at all. Right? Why? Why? In is that answer?
Because as Coach stated, we're built on a democracy. He said that democracy is basically built upon slaves. So whatever America does is so integrated into those roots.
Okay, let me just do a little correction. I appreciate what you're saying. It's nuanced, but he really said that American democracy is based upon white supremacy, right? Stated differently, American democracy is based upon certain people being favored and other people being subjugated. So he's talking about, for instance, when our founding fathers wrote the Constitution, and when we declared and won our independence in the Revolutionary War, what did we do? We built a country where, yes, freedom and liberty were the watchwords of the Constitution, the watchwords of all of our public rhetoric, but at the same time, blacks couldn't vote, women couldn't vote, Native Americans couldn't vote. In fact, blacks weren't free, Native Americans had their land stolen, all in the name of what? Freedom and liberty and equality, right? So, to get back to his comment, Coates is arguing that American democracy itself is built upon white supremacy or built upon a way by which certain people keep other people from having power. So who's equal? His view. Who are the people who enjoy liberty and equality and freedom in his view? Who? White folks. White folks. In fact, he says, these black folks earned, through killing whites, through fighting on the side of the North, they earned their freedom, and 8 years later, they were, well, re-enslaved. And the North stood by and did nothing. Let them do it. After 750,000 people died, let them go back to their old ways. Right? Okay. Question number 2. How important is true, accurate history? And what must true history confront?
I guess history is very important. And the goal of history is to bring all the people together, all united, and history is very important.
Okay, are you saying that history is sometimes used to unify people? To bring them together? Okay. Are you saying that that kind of history is always true history?
Sometimes.
Sometimes. Okay. All right. How about you, sir? How important is true, accurate history, and what must true, accurate history confront?
Accurate history is so that we cannot make mistakes that our forefathers did, and true history has to have every single detail that it happened. You cannot leave anything out.
Okay. All right. Okay. I'll buy that. True, accurate history. What's it needed for? Why do we need true, accurate history? What does it dispel? You don't know? All right. Any of you guys? What does it dispel? What does true history dispel in Coates's argument? Okay, all right. Right. Not sugarcoating it and making it seem like, this was just a misunderstanding, right? this was something that, well, it was a misunderstanding, but it was also about something very clear-cut, right? Okay. All right. Somebody else want to grab this one? Somebody else? What'd you put? What'd you put for number 2? How important is true, accurate history? What must true history confront?
I think true, accurate history is really important, and I think true history should confront the events that really happened without biased opinions.
Okay. All right. So, all right. Let's see what I have here. I took some quotes out. The accurate history of the Civil War breaks the myth. True history eradicates myth. And so the history is ignored and fictions are weaved into our art and politics that dress villainy in martyrdom and transform banditry into chivalry. The implications of the true story are existential and corrosive to our larger national myth. What do you think about that?
I agree.
Okay. Who can distill? Well, let's actually jump ahead here. Let's jump ahead real quick. What's the common theory of the Civil War most of the country holds to? What's the common theory?
Just as a quote from the reading, Coates said that the common theory is that emancipation and civil rights were redemptive. So it's sort of like a theme throughout American history that like every hardship that we go through comes out with like a happy ending, or like somebody kind of like everyone's satisfied with how it ends, but that's not really the case with the Civil War, even though that's like the narrative that we kind of portray it as.
Okay, it's redemptive.
Yeah.
So that the struggle itself is redemptive, is what he's saying.
Yeah.
Okay. What about the rest of the there's some other aspects of the common theory. What did you come up with? You don't know. What did you come up with? What did you come up with? You? You? All right. You? No? You? Okay. All right. Let me see if I can jump in here. So, the common theory is that emancipation and civil rights were redemptive. And this view, this common theory, is held by people on the left and on the right. Okay? That emancipation itself and civil rights were redemptive. They allowed our country to kind of be redeemed. Made us better, right? And this common theory, he says, upholds the possibility of ultimate reconciliation between the sin of slavery and the democratic ideal, or the myth, right? So let me stop there and have you kind of all pay attention to me. Don't look up there at the screen. Look at me. The answer to the question about true history is that true history does away with myth. Coates is arguing, is he not? Is he not arguing that as Americans, we have embraced a myth about the Civil War? Not the truth about the Civil War, but a myth about the Civil War. I see you shaking your head. You buy that? You want to comment? Okay, all right. It's also, this common theory is also a progressive thing, so that the country's getting better, and also that it's inevitable that the country gets better. So, you shouldn't have to ask to make America great again if you buy this national myth, maybe, because America is just always getting better and better and better all the time. This is part of the common theory of the Civil War. The problem is that this common theory, or this myth, and here's where I'm trying to get, this myth erases all evidence of the crime of white supremacy. So, after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, what did the writers, the historians from the South, what essentially did they say about the Civil War? What did they say? Was it about slavery in their mind? No, it wasn't about slavery. What was it about? She touched on it earlier.
Just like a disagreement.
Yeah, it's a disagreement. Some pretty good guys, brothers, decided to pull their guns out and shoot at one another, right? It cost 750,000 lives, but in the end, it was just a misunderstanding, right? And if it's just a misunderstanding, if it was just a misunderstanding, well, it's just a misunderstanding. But that's not what Coates is arguing, that it really was. He's saying it was an obfuscation. It was an attempt to, deceive. But deceive, why? So I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but you said very astutely that it was redemptive. So, let me ask you this. Let's assume for a minute that in your schools that you just came out of, you weren't taught this history, the one that we're going over now. Let's just assume for a minute. Why?
Because
was it to protect you as a child, as a student, a young person?
it really wasn't. It was more probably to still hold some redemption in the eyes of the youth.
In the youth?
The youth are going to be the future of the country, so they still want to be somewhat redemptive to the youth, which is why I can go into like a whole bunch of other stuff. I know, like in Turkey, they didn't teach about the Armenian genocide for the longest time.
Why?
They want to be redemptive.
Was it for the children that they didn't teach about it?
No.
Why? Why didn't they teach about the Armenian genocide?
They wanted to forget that ever happened. And that
Because why? Because why?
They were
The bad guys.
Because they were the bad guys, right? Because they still held those views, right? Coates' argument is that the reason we embrace a national myth, not the truth, but a national myth, isn't to save the children in school, it's to save their parents. It's to save the generations who went before the children. It is essentially to help certain people in our society redeem themselves against this horrible, horrible history. So, when I start talking about this kind of stuff, what do I frequently hear from my white friends or my white students? I'll tell you what I hear. I didn't do this. I'm not a racist. Right? Yeah.
So it was like the time Germany tried to deny that the Holocaust ever happened.
Or for that matter, some knucklehead in Visalia that used to be one of the leading Holocaust deniers in the country 30 years ago, in the world 30 years ago, right? Yeah. It's like, and the reason isn't to save the children in the schools from embarrassing information. It's actually so that the society doesn't have to deal with, shall we say, the reality that in this case, if Coates is right, white supremacy is fundamental in this country. And has always been. And still is, he would say. Right? So this national myth then erases the crime of white supremacy, but it also. And by the way, let me just ask a question. Does white supremacy only hurt people who aren't white? If I'm a white supremacist, and I engage in white supremacist thinking, is that good for me? Is it good for my children? Is it good for my community? Even if all of those people are white? This is a point that I think people need to kind of sit down with and think about, and that is, white supremacy doesn't just hurt people of color. It hurts the people who are, in fact, the white supremacists, too. It's bad for them, it's bad for their children, it's bad for their country. Right? So, it erase all the evidence of the crime of white supremacy, the national myth. It also allows, well, people like me to continue to think that, I don't have any white supremacist thinking in me, right? It's getting complicated, and I'm kind of running out of time here. So I'm a little unsatisfied with this discussion, only because it seems to me that I haven't done a very good job of helping us all flesh this out. But let me see if I can sum this up. It seems to me, when Coates asks the question, why do black people not study the Civil War? His answer is, because the Civil War, that is part of the common national myth, the story of the Civil War, the way it was communicated to you in high school, the Civil War is not the Civil War black people experienced, which is to say, they were ecstatic that they got their freedom. To them, the Civil War was bigger than the Revolutionary War. You understand, of course, the political right fetishizes the Revolutionary War, but runs from the Civil War. He's saying, blacks loved the Civil War and love it still, but they don't study it because the national myth doesn't include them. It's not their story, and they know it's not their story. And in fact, it just turns them into a problem. Now, let me finish by saying this. If I were Latino, I would feel, at this point in time, because of the political rhetoric in this country, I would feel like I was a problem. I personally think our country is treating Latinos like they're criminals, rapists, and murderers, that they're a problem. Well, Coates is saying that the national myth about the Civil War does the same thing with blacks. It turns them into a problem. Now, let me finish by saying this. I don't know how to manage the fact that I have brown students and black students and Asian students in my classes. I don't know how to talk about this stuff with also feeling like I might be saying, you're a problem. But that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you're not a problem, but I'm saying the national myth, this story that people tell, that they embrace, and then it gets inculcated in our schools and maybe never gets corrected, turns black people into a problem, and Coates is saying that's why they won't study the Civil War. Because the Civil War itself is not their Civil War. You follow me? All right, that's all I got.